The night before I was born, lightning struck the old iron gate my father would one day guard, and the villagers said it was an omen, that the child of a man who opened doors for others would one day walk through the one no one believed belonged to her. From that day, every clang of that gate became the drumbeat of my life, the sound of hunger disguised as hope. They said my father was just a gatekeeper, but in my eyes he was the first king I ever knew, his crown forged from sweat and faith, his throne, the small wooden stool beside the steel doors that led into the richest company in the city. Each dawn, he ironed his faded uniform with a precision that bordered on prayer, the scent of hot charcoal filling our single-room house before the roosters even stirred. By the time I opened my eyes, he had already left, his footsteps echoing down the dirt path like a man walking toward his purpose rather than his punishment. When I was old enough to follow him, I would hide behind the jacaranda tree across the street and watch him stand at attention, back straight, face calm, greeting people who never looked at him. The company logo above the gate gleamed like polished gold, and the men and women who walked past him carried an air of belonging that made the dust beneath their shoes seem holy. To me, it looked like another world, one my father guarded but could never touch. He knew I watched. Sometimes, as the sun began to bleed across the glass windows, he would turn ever so slightly, just enough to wink. That wink was a secret handshake between our two worlds, his silent way of saying, "Don't let this be your ceiling." Inside that company were stories we could only imagine. I heard rumors from the workers who swept the floors and carried deliveries, marble staircases that spiraled to offices smelling of imported perfume, machines that could make fortunes while a man like my father made barely enough to keep rice on our table. Yet he never cursed his fate. "The gate feeds us," he said, "and gratitude keeps the wolves away." Still, there were nights when gratitude felt like a chain. I remember one evening when rain turned the dust to red clay, and he came home drenched, uniform clinging to his skin, the company logo shining faintly under the lantern light. I asked if anyone helped him, and he smiled in that tired, hollow way that made my chest ache. "Help," he said softly. "My duty is to open, not to enter." That sentence followed me for years. It was the moment I realized that loyalty and dignity can imprison a man just as surely as poverty. Our neighbors gossiped that I was wasting my mind dreaming of college. "She's a gatekeeper's daughter," they'd whisper. "Let her learn to serve tea, not chase paper." My mother would lower her eyes and say nothing, but my father would straighten, jaw set, and answer, "She'll walk through that gate one day, and she won't need a key." He believed that even when the world didn't. I think that's what killed him, the effort of carrying belief alone. The years blurred together like the view through the iron bars. I grew taller, his back grew smaller, and every birthday candle I blew out came with the same wish. Let him live long enough to see me cross that gate. But life rarely grants mercy when you need it most. The company changed management. New faces brought new rules, and respect became another casualty of progress. They made him work longer shifts, reduced his pay, replaced his stool with a concrete block for security reasons. Yet every morning, he still polished his badge, a tiny oval of brass that reflected his face back at him, like a reminder that worth doesn't depend on wage. Then came the morning I'll never forget. I woke to silence where there should have been the sound of his boots. The tea on the stove had gone cold. I ran the path to the company, heart hammering, and found him still at his post, uniform damp with dew, eyes closed as if he were simply resting. The doctor said it was exhaustion, that his heart had simply decided to stop. But I knew better. You can't measure exhaustion in heartbeats. You measure it in years of being unseen. When they carried him away, the executives ordered the gate repainted before noon. By evening, there was no sign he had ever stood there. Only his badge remained, half buried in the dirt where his stool once sat. I picked it up, brushed the soil from its surface, and saw my reflection staring back. I remember thinking how strange it was that grief could burn brighter than any sunrise. That night, I couldn't sleep. The air in our house felt too still, too hollow. My mother wept quietly into her scarf, and outside the wind pushed against the roof as if it wanted to remind us the world was still moving. I sat by the window, holding his badge against my chest until its edges left marks on my skin. And in that heavy silence, I heard his voice, soft, weary, certain, whisper from somewhere I couldn't see. The gates of men never open for people like us. The words carved themselves into my soul, not as surrender, but as prophecy. Because in that moment, I made a vow to the night itself. If no one will open the gate for us, I'll build the power to open it myself. And when I do, the world will remember his name. They built the company like a palace and the fence like a warning. Beyond those silver bars, men in suits carved the world's future, while my father stood outside, guarding it as if he belonged. Every morning, the sound of that gate opening was his hymn, and the silence that followed was proof that no one heard his prayer. To the world, my father was a uniform, neat, polite, forgettable. But to me, he was the heartbeat of the company he didn't own. He opened the same gate every morning at 6, rain or dust, greeting men whose eyes slid past him as if he were part of the metal itself. They didn't know his name, yet they trusted his, hands with their keys, their cars, their safety. He was invisible, but necessary, the kind of man the world runs on but never thanks. I used to stand across the road, watching the rhythm of that place. The engines purred, heels clicked, briefcases gleamed like trophies. Laughter echoed from glass offices where the air smelled of perfume and power. Behind the fence, the lawns were trimmed like pride itself grew there. But outside, where my father stood, the air tasted like dust and effort. He carried humility like armor. Even when an executive tossed his car keys at him without looking, my father would bow slightly, pick them up, and say, "Welcome, sir." His voice never cracked. He never fought back. I used to mistake that for weakness, until I learned that silence is often the language of the brave. At home, he kept that silence. He'd take off his hat, polish the same shoes he'd been wearing for 10 years, and ask if I'd eaten. My mother, stirring stew over the charcoal fire, would look at me and whisper, "Don't stare at the fence too long, child. Dreams break people like us." But I couldn't stop. The fence called to me, not like an invitation, but like a dare. I remember one afternoon when the sun baked the road to glass and the air shimmered with heat. I brought my father his lunch, rice and beans wrapped in old newspaper, and found him sitting on a stool by the gate, head bowed, his hands trembling slightly from exhaustion. Yet when he saw me, he smiled, as if my presence alone could erase the day's cruelty. That was when the black car pulled up. Long, gleaming, arrogant. A man stepped out, adjusting his tie like he owned the wind. His shoes caught the sunlight, Italian leather, clean enough to reflect the faces of those who bowed to him. My father rose instantly, saluting. "Good afternoon, sir." The man didn't reply. He looked at my father's shoes, cracked, dusty, the sole half torn, and laughed. Not just a small laugh, but the kind that wounds without words. "Even the dogs in my house wear better shoes," he said, and the men beside him snickered. Something inside me broke. The world tilted. I clutched the lunch tighter, my knuckles whitening, and felt heat rise in my chest that no sun could cause. My father didn't move. He simply smiled, the same tired, practiced smile, and said, "Enjoy your day, sir." His voice didn't tremble, but his eyes did. When they walked away, I handed him the lunchbox, my throat too tight for words. He placed a hand on my head and said softly, "Don't let their laughter make you cruel. Let it make you stronger." I didn't answer, because at that moment, I didn't want to be strong. I wanted to be seen. That night, I couldn't eat. The man's laughter followed me into my dreams, echoing between the bars of that shining fence. I woke up shaking, staring at the moonlight spilling through our window, wondering how a world so bright could be, built on so much darkness. For the first time, I understood what my father meant when he said, "The gate teaches patience." But I also understood something he never said, that patience can rot if it never finds justice. The next morning, I walked back to that company with his lunch in my hands and rage in my veins. I wasn't going to deliver food, I was going to deliver a promise. But when I reached the gate, the same executive was standing there again, smirking, talking about the old man with torn shoes. I froze, every muscle burning. And right there, as his laughter cut through the air, I felt my childhood slip quietly out of me, replaced by something heavier, sharper, unstoppable. That was the day my innocence died, and my ambition was born. Grief never arrives as thunder. It comes dressed as an ordinary morning. The sun rose warm that day. The wind smelled of roasted maize, and my father whistled on his way to work, a sound so rare it startled the birds. I remember thinking the world had finally decided to be kind to him. But kindness, I would learn, is the world's most beautiful trap. It lets you breathe once before it takes the air away. That morning, he ironed his uniform twice, humming the hymn he always sang when nervous. "The gate must shine today," he said. And I laughed because the gate always shone. He polished it like it was his inheritance. He kissed my mother's forehead, promised to bring home a small bag of sugar, and stepped into the street like a man certain of tomorrow. I didn't know he was walking toward his undoing. By midday, the rumors began to crawl through the village. A neighbor burst through our door, breathless. "They've caught him," she whispered. "They say the old gatekeeper was stealing from the company." My mother froze mid-stir, the wooden spoon trembling in her hand. The smell of stew turned bitter. I ran before she could stop me. The road to the company felt longer than it ever had. People stared as I passed. Not with pity yet, but with curiosity, the kind that waits to see whether tragedy is real. When I reached the gates, the place that once looked enormous now felt small and cruel. Workers stood in a semicircle. Executives watched from the stairs. My father stood in the center, hands bound by shame instead of rope. A manager I'd never seen before, sleek suit, voice like polished glass, waved an envelope above his head. "Company funds," he announced. "Missing for weeks. Found in his booth." The crowd murmured, heads shaking, eyes sliding away from him like water avoiding dirt. My father's cap lay in the dust, his badge hanging crooked against his chest. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He simply said, "If I speak, you won't listen. If I'm silent, maybe you'll forget sooner." His words struck me harder than any denial could have. The manager smiled thinly, satisfied. "Silence is confession," he said, and with that, he turned, his back, as if justice had been served. Someone spat near his feet. Another laughed. The laughter spread, brittle and cold. I wanted to shout that they were wrong, to tear through the fence and stand beside him. But I couldn't move. Fear had hands that day, and it wrapped them around my throat. When they released him at dusk, the sun had already lost its color. He walked past me without a word, his eyes distant, his shoulders heavy as if carrying the weight of every insult at once. Only when we reached home did he speak. "You saw?" he asked. I nodded, unable to breathe. He sat by the door, took off his shoes, and said quietly, "They took my job, not my honor. But a man can't feed his family with honor." My mother wept softly behind the curtain. I sat beside him, staring at his hands, the same hands that once held mine steady on my first day of school. They were shaking, not from anger, but from the exhaustion of a man who had given everything and been paid in humiliation. He turned to me. "Listen to me, child," he said, voice breaking like old wood. The world will always need someone to open its doors, but it will never thank them. Promise me you'll never stand outside, one waiting for permission." His eyes glistened. I had never seen them so tired. "Promise me you'll walk through." I wanted to promise, but words refused to come. I just held his hand, trying to memorize the warmth before the night stole it. He smiled faintly, that same rare smile from the morning. "That's enough," he whispered. Then he stood, picked up his badge, and walked out into the darkness as if it were another shift. He never came back. At dawn, they found him by the gate, the one he had guarded more faithfully than his own heart, lying on the ground, eyes closed, badge still shining against his chest. The report said heart failure. But I knew better. The world had finally done what it always intended. It waited for him to smile, and then it took everything. That morning, I buried my father's cap, and the part of me that still believed the world was fair. The day we buried my father, the sky looked guilty. The clouds hung low, swollen but refusing to weep, as if heaven itself was ashamed of what it had allowed. The air smelled of dust and iron, the scent of uniforms and unpaid labor. I stood barefoot before his coffin, staring at the man who had guarded another man's empire until it killed him. They called it a funeral. I called it a beginning, because while the earth swallowed his body, I made a promise that the world would remember his name through mine. The drums began slow, deep, ancient. They didn't just mourn him. They judged the world that had crushed him. Women wailed softly, their voices trembling like cracked glass. My mother knelt beside his coffin, her hands trembling as she placed his cap upon his chest. It was the same cap he'd worn every day of his life, the one that had shaded him from the sun, but never from humiliation. His badge, polished and gleaming, rested above his heart. Even in death, he wore the uniform that broke him. The elders spoke words about dignity and humility, about how hard work is its own reward. I wanted to scream that dignity doesn't feed a family, that humility is only beautiful until it's used to keep you small. But I stayed silent, just like he had all his life. When it was my turn to speak, I stepped forward, feeling the entire village's eyes on me. "Baba spent his life guarding their dreams," I said, "but I will take them. You stood behind their gates. I'll walk through them." My mother gasped softly, but the wind seemed to rise in agreement. A gust swept through the yard, stirring the dust into small spirals that danced over his grave. It felt like the earth was listening, like my father's spirit was standing tall again, proud, unseen, but near. After the burial, the villagers drifted away in silence, murmuring blessings they didn't believe in. I stayed long after they were gone. The night came quietly, wrapping the graves in silver moonlight. I knelt by his mound and pressed my fingers into the fresh soil. The earth was still warm from the sun, or maybe from him. I spoke softly, the way I used to when I was a child afraid of the dark. "They took everything from you, Baba. Your job, your pride, even your breath. But they won't take your story. You gave me your name, your silence, your strength. I'll use them all." The moonlight caught the edge of his badge, glinting faintly beneath the soil. I dug it out, cleaned it with my sleeve, and held it to my heart. That small piece of metal carried the weight of every insult, every unspoken prayer, every night he came home too tired to sit. I fastened it inside my shirt. "You guarded the gate," I whispered. "Now I'll open it." When I returned home, the house felt smaller, emptier, but also different, like something sacred had begun to stir within those cracked walls. My mother sat by the window, her eyes hollow but knowing. "You're leaving, aren't you?" she asked. I nodded. She didn't cry. She just said, "Then make sure they remember who raised you." At dawn, I packed everything I owned into one small bag, 2 dresses, a notebook, and his badge wrapped in cloth. The bus station was miles away, but my feet didn't ache. The road stretched wide, the air sharp with promise. As I climbed aboard the rusted bus, I pressed my palm against the window, watching the acacia tree by his grave grow smaller in the distance. I could almost see him standing there, uniform straight, eyes proud, waiting for me to come back different. As the bus rolled forward, I whispered to the wind, "One day, Baba, they'll open that gate for me, not because they want to, but because I'll own the keys." The engine roared, drowning my voice, but in my chest, I felt the truth of it burn like dawn. The girl who left, that village was not her father's daughter anymore. She was his promise, and she was coming for the world that killed him. The city greeted me the way it greets all outsiders, with noise, smoke, and indifference. It didn't care that my father had died guarding its gates. It didn't care that my pockets held nothing but a folded bus ticket and his rusted badge. I stepped off that bus with shoes too thin for its streets, staring at towers of glass that glittered like lies, and I swore under my breath that someday, one of those buildings would bear my name. The city may not have remembered who I was, but I carried a gate in my heart that refused to stay closed. The first nights were cruel. The room I rented was little more than a box above a welding shop, walls stained with rust, air thick with the scent of oil. I lay awake listening to metal being cut below, thinking of my father's hands, how they once carried the same smell of steel. Sometimes I imagined him standing at his post, silent beneath the sun, unaware that the gate he guarded would one day become the symbol of my revenge. College wasn't easier. Every corridor was a battlefield of class and confidence. The wealthy students spoke English like silk. Mine still carried the dust of my village. They arrived in cars that gleamed like mirrors. I arrived on foot, my books tied together with string. They wore ambition as fashion, while mine clung to me like hunger. Still, I refused to bow. Every rejection fueled me. Every humiliation became a stepping stone. I cleaned offices at night, wiped the footprints of executives from floors I swore I'd one day walk in heels of my own. In the mornings, I served tea to students who didn't remember my name, but remembered my mistakes. There were days I studied on an empty stomach, my vision blurring over the words. Yet I never let myself cry. My father's voice echoed in my head. "Keep standing, even when the world kneels you down." But sometimes even strength feels like a curse. I remember one afternoon, I failed an exam because I'd overslept after a night shift. My professor looked at me with disappointment, unaware that I hadn't eaten in 2 days. I walked out of that hall and sat on the cold cement stairs, shaking. I wanted to scream, to break something, but I only pressed my father's badge against my chest until the anger turned to fire. It was during that time I met Professor Adeyemi, a man whose presence filled silence like sunlight fills a dark room. I wasn't his student. I was the girl who cleaned the seminar floor after everyone had left. One evening, as I swept near his desk, he asked without looking up, "Why do you stay so late, child?" I froze. "Because someday, sir, I'll stand where you're standing." He smiled, not kindly, but knowingly, as if he recognized that kind of hunger. From that day, he became my quiet mentor, lending me old books, teaching me to speak with my scars instead of hiding them. Years passed in small victories. I earned scholarships, top grades, and respect. But still no doors opened. Every company I applied to looked at my last name and saw poverty written in it. Until one morning, I saw a job posting for interns at Aurelius Holdings, the very company my father once guarded. My heart stopped. It felt like fate had come back to challenge me. I wore my borrowed suit, tied my hair back, and pinned his badge inside my blouse like armor. The building's mirrored glass reflected a stranger, strong, composed, but trembling inside. During the interview, the panel smiled until they saw my surname. "Ah," one of them said, with that sharp politeness only power can afford. "You must be related to the old Gatekeeper. Unfortunate story." Her voice cut through me like glass. I answered every question perfectly, but I already knew I wouldn't be chosen. A week later, the rejection email came. We have decided to move forward with other candidates. I deleted it without reading the rest. That night, I walked through the streets, aimless. The city lights blurred like tears I refused to shed. I didn't realize where I was going until I looked up and saw it. The gate. The same one that had once marked the boundary between my father's dignity and their wealth. I moved closer, heart pounding, until I saw the new guard standing beneath the lamp. He wore the same dark blue uniform, the same polished shoes, but what stopped me was the badge. No, 247. My father's badge number. For a moment the world tilted. The guard leaned lazily against the gate, humming, unaware of the history pinned to his chest. My chest tightened with grief and fury so deep it nearly broke me. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that number didn't belong to him. It belonged to a man who gave his life to this place, and to the daughter who would one day claim it back. I stood there, trembling beneath the streetlight, whispering to the gate that had stolen everything from us. "Not yet," I said softly. "But one day, I'll walk through you, and when I do, you'll open to my name." Then I turned away, carrying my father's badge pressed to my heart, knowing that my war with the world had only just begun. When they wouldn't let me through the front gate, I found another door. It wasn't lined with gold or guarded by pride. It smelled of bleach, rust, and forgotten people. That's how I entered the same company that once took my father's life, not as a dreamer or an executive, but as a cleaner with borrowed shoes and a false name. I told myself I wasn't going there to work. I was going there to remember. Aurelius Holdings stood higher now, its towers glimmering in the sun, like blades of glass cutting the sky. The logo at the top shimmered in the heat, and for a moment it looked like a crown. But I knew better. I'd seen what that crown was built on: sweat, silence, and the bones of men, like my father. The job came through a contractor who didn't care who I was. They handed me a faded blue uniform and a badge that read, "Maintenance Assistant." The letters felt wrong on my chest, but I wore it anyway. Every thread of that uniform reminded me of the one my father had died in. I told myself I was wearing his ghost, and this time, it would not go quietly. Inside, the building was everything the outside world worshipped: polished marble, perfumed air, and people who walked as if the floor belonged to them. I blended in like a shadow. No one looked at me twice, and that was my advantage. While they ignored me, I was watching them, learning how power moved, how lies dressed themselves in suits, how greed smiled politely. I saw how the executives spoke to each other. Their laughter was always loudest when they were hiding something. I saw how they treated the guards, the cleaners, the clerks, people like us who built their empire but were invisible in its light. Once, an executive dropped his coffee cup and stared at me with disgust. "Clean that up quickly," he said, "before someone important walks by." I bent down to wipe it, but inside, I promised myself that one day, he would be the one cleaning up after me. Days turned into weeks, and every night after my shift, I stayed late pretending to finish work while secretly studying the company's systems. I learned which files were locked, which doors were restricted, and which meetings mattered most. I found shortcuts between departments, learned which executives cheated the company, which managers stole from their own reports, and which leaders lied in prayer every morning before lying again on paper. One evening, while cleaning the upper floors, I found myself outside the Human Resources Archive Room, a quiet corner with dust-coated cabinets labeled with years. I don't know what drew me in that night, but something inside whispered that my father's truth was waiting behind those drawers. The key hung on a hook beside the door, as if daring me to take it. My hands shook when I turned the lock and opened the cabinet marked Security, 2003 to 2007. There were files, dozens of them, names, records, photographs of guards long forgotten. I went through them one by one until my throat tightened. His wasn't there. My father's name, gone. Not listed, not erased, just replaced, like he had never existed at all. My knees buckled, and I sank to the cold floor, surrounded by the ghosts of men who had been remembered just enough to keep the company's conscience clean. For a long time, I just sat there in the silence, the smell of dust and ink pressing around me. I wanted to scream, to rip every page until the lies bled through the paper. But I didn't. Instead, I ran my fingers across the empty space where his name should have been, and I made a promise. Not to the company, not to the gods, but to the ghost that still guarded me. They erased you, I whispered into the dark. But I will make the world remember. I stood, eyes burning, heart steady, and slipped the key back onto the hook. As I walked out into the corridor, the reflection of the company's logo glinted in the glass wall beside me, sharp and cold, like a mirror of vengeance. You broke him, I murmured, but you'll never break me. And that night, beneath the golden lights of Aurelius Holdings, the daughter of a gatekeeper began carving her father's name into history. One silent step at a time. Sometimes the ones who smile with you are just measuring where to stab. I learned that the hard way, surrounded by people who wore poverty like loyalty until ambition made them cruel. In a place like Aurelius Holdings, betrayal wasn't an accident. It was a language, one I had yet to understand. But the day it spoke to me, I learned to answer in fire. Months had passed since I found my father's erased name, and though the rage still burned quietly inside me, I buried it beneath discipline. I came early, left late, and did my work with precision so sharp it left no room for error. I wasn't just cleaning floors anymore. I was cleaning the path toward power. Some of the junior staff began to notice, and not everyone liked it. There was one among them, Nadia, a woman whose laughter came too easily, whose kindness always came with questions. She had started as my friend, or at least I thought so. We shared cheap meals during breaks, traded small dreams about escaping the corridors that reeked of bleach and hierarchy. She called me sister, and for a while I believed her. But envy has a quiet way of pretending to care. One Monday morning, chaos erupted. The accounting department claimed that a set of confidential documents, records of transactions I had seen once while cleaning, had gone missing. Security was called. Desks were searched. Names were whispered. And before the day ended, mine rose above them all. They called me into the manager's office, the air thick with accusation. You had access to those files, one of the executives said. His tone wasn't questioning. It was sentencing. My throat tightened, my hands trembling against the cheap fabric of my uniform. I tried to explain, to tell them I hadn't touched anything, but the evidence, planted, precise, was already waiting. A file folder in my cleaning cart, documents I had never seen before. Nadia stood among the staff outside, her eyes filled with practiced shock. That was when I understood. She had sold me to protect herself. They suspended me pending investigation, which was just another word for quiet dismissal. As I packed my few things, humiliation pressed against my ribs like a bruise. But humiliation was something I'd worn before. It didn't fit me anymore. That night, I didn't cry. I studied. I retraced every detail of that week, every face, every move, until I found the thread that connected it all. The next morning, I returned unannounced, carrying proof, a copy of the building's surveillance log that showed Nadia entering the office long after her shift ended. When I laid it on the manager's desk, the room fell silent. My voice didn't shake when I said, I clean floors, not consciences. For the first time, they looked at me differently, not as a worker, but as a woman who refused to be erased. The manager who had been silently watching stood up. His suit was expensive, his expression unreadable. He walked around the desk, stopped beside me, and extended his hand. The same man who once mocked my father for guarding the rich man's gate looked me in the eyes and said, "You belong upstairs, not here." His words carried the weight of prophecy, but all I could think about was the promise I made over my father's grave, that one day the gate would open. I just never expected it to open from the inside. For the first time, I walked through the gate, not as a servant, not as a shadow, but as someone they had to greet. The same steel bars that had once separated my father from the world of power now parted for me, like a curtain. The guards saluted as I entered, unaware that one of their own had returned wearing a new name, carrying an old promise. I didn't smile, because I knew this was not victory yet. This was the beginning of a reckoning. They called it a promotion, but to me, it felt like an invitation to a different kind of battlefield. I was no longer a cleaner. I was now a management trainee, a title polished with respect, but heavy with expectation. My new office was small, tucked behind the HR wing, its walls smelling of paint and old ambition. Still, when I ran my hand across the wooden desk, I thought of my father's calloused palms and whispered, "We made it past the gate, Baba." The days that followed were a storm of tests, not of knowledge, but of endurance. The executives who once ignored me now watched closely, half curious, half threatened. Some congratulated me with thin smiles that hid resentment. Others questioned my credentials in meetings, their words sharpened with disbelief. I learned quickly that success for people like me was never accepted. It had to be proven again and again until the world grew too tired to doubt. The company's inner workings revealed a rot that went deeper than I'd imagined. Departments competed not for excellence, but for survival. Promotions were traded like currency. Loyalty was bought, not earned. I watched people betray colleagues for a seat closer to power and call it strategy. Every day, I felt the old anger rise, the one that whispered to me, to burn it all from within, to expose them, to make them feel the humiliation my father endured. But vengeance, I realized, was just another kind of chain, one that bound me to the very pain I was trying to escape. So I chose something harder: reform. Began treating the janitors, guards, and clerks, the invisible ones, with the respect the world denied them. I learned their names, remembered their stories, listened to their silences. Slowly, something shifted. Meetings that once ended in mockery began to end in quiet respect. Even those who despised me couldn't ignore the results. Departments under my supervision started performing better, not because of fear, but because for the first time, someone believed in them. It wasn't easy. Nights stretched into dawns, and I carried both exhaustion and pride like twin burdens. I failed often, cried silently, doubted everything. But each time, I saw my father standing by that old gate, smiling like the sun was finally warm enough to touch. One afternoon, during a leadership seminar, the company's director asked a question meant to test our values. "Where," he asked, "did you learn loyalty?" The room went quiet. All eyes turned toward me. I took a deep breath, feeling every scar, every silence, every sacrifice that brought me there. "From the man," I said softly, "who guarded your dreams while you slept." The room fell into stillness, the kind that lingers between guilt and revelation. And as I met their eyes, I knew the gatekeeper's daughter was no longer outside. She was standing in the boardroom, holding the key. Power doesn't scare me anymore, because I've already knelt to something greater: hunger. Hunger for dignity, for redemption, for the right to stand where my father once bowed. I had starved through humiliation, swallowed grief until it became steel in my spine. So when I finally entered the boardroom, that glass coffin where decisions were made over lives like ours, I wasn't trembling. I was ready to haunt it. Years had passed since I wore that cleaner's uniform, but sometimes I still caught the faint smell of disinfectant when I was nervous. It reminded me of where I came from, a quiet warning never to let the shine blind me. My name now carried weight inside Aurelius Holdings. Senior Executive of Operations, a title that had once belonged to men who never looked me in the eye. I now signed the documents they used to wave in my father's face. The boardroom itself was a study in arrogance: glass walls, imported marble table, portraits of men who had built empires out of other people's sweat. Their eyes seemed to follow me when I walked in for meetings, as though shocked that someone like me now dared to sit among them. The first time I took my seat at the long table, the air thickened. No one said it aloud, but I could feel it. The unspoken disbelief that the gatekeeper's daughter had climbed this high. Corruption lived here, disguised as etiquette. Deals were made in coded language, favors traded beneath polished smiles. I learned that power was not loud. It whispered, it bargained, it pretended to be polite. I also learned that integrity was the most expensive currency in that room, and I was the only one willing to spend it. Once, during a high-stakes negotiation, an executive leaned across the table and said, "You're too honest to survive here." I met his gaze and replied, "Then maybe survival isn't my goal." My words hung in the air, sharp enough to slice through the pretense. That was the day the whispers began. Some called me brave, others called me dangerous. Both were true, but not everyone in that room was blind. The chairman, a man with eyes as old as the company itself, watched me with quiet interest. He rarely spoke, but when he did, people listened. I caught him studying me during meetings, as if measuring the distance between where I was and where he once stood. He asked no questions, but his silence carried weight, a kind of mentorship without words. Under my leadership, departments began to change. Employees who had been invisible started to rise, and the culture that once fed on fear began to taste respect. It wasn't a revolution. It was a slow, deliberate rewriting of power. Yet with every success, I felt something building in the air. An expectation, a test I couldn't yet name. One evening, after a long meeting where I'd refused to approve a corrupt contract, the chairman called me into his office. The room smelled faintly of old leather and rain. He stood by the window, the city lights flickering across his face like memory. Without speaking, he opened a drawer, pulled out a sealed envelope, and placed it in my hands. His eyes, calm but knowing, met mine. "Open it when you're ready to lead," he said quietly. His tone wasn't commanding. It was prophetic. I turned the envelope over, my fingers tracing the embossed seal of Aurelius Holdings. Something told me this wasn't a promotion. It was an inheritance, not of wealth, but of war. And as I walked out of that room, the ghosts in the portraits seemed to bow their heads, as if they knew one of their own was about to fall, and another was about to rise. When I opened the letter, I didn't just read words, I read destiny. The seal broke with a whisper, and in that sound I heard echoes of my father's voice, the rhythm of every step I'd taken from the dirt outside the gate to the glass walls of the boardroom. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of a promise that had finally come home. The letter had sat on my desk for 3 days, heavy and silent, like a question I was afraid to answer. I had run my fingers over its surface countless times, feeling the texture of the embossed logo, the authority in its stillness. But that evening, after the sun dipped behind the towers and the world outside turned to gold, I knew I couldn't delay any longer. I broke the seal, unfolded the paper, and began to read. It wasn't a long letter, barely a page, yet every line felt like a heartbeat. The words were formal, written in the company's precise corporate language, but beneath the ink, I could feel something deeper. Effective immediately, you are hereby appointed as Chief Executive Officer of Aurelius Holdings. For a moment, the world went utterly quiet. The city outside, the hum of air conditioners, the pulse of my own breath, everything stopped. I didn't cry, not right away. I sat there staring at the paper, my reflection faintly mirrored in its whiteness, and all I could see was my father, standing by the gate in his worn uniform, nodding at cars that never slowed down. I saw his tired smile, the way he used to polish his badge even when no one noticed, and the way he always stood a little straighter when I waved from across the road. That image, once a wound, now felt like a crown. When the tears finally came, they were quiet. I placed the letter beside his old badge, the one I had kept hidden in my drawer for years, its metal dulled but unforgotten. It still carried his initials, etched faintly along the edge, proof that even in death, he had left something the world couldn't erase. That night, I didn't celebrate. I drove to the old gatehouse, the one that still stood at the company's main entrance, though it had long been repainted and rebuilt. The guard on duty saluted when he saw me, unaware that I had once stood on the other side of that very barrier. I asked him for a moment alone. The wind was cold, sharp with memory. I ran my hand along the steel bars, tracing the rough edges, the places time had bitten into metal. It felt like touching history, like shaking hands with every version of myself that had once stood outside, dreaming. I closed my eyes, leaned my forehead against the gate, and whispered, "It's open now, Baba." The wind stirred, carrying the faint scent of rain, and for an instant, I thought I heard his voice again, soft, proud, unbroken. "Walk through," it said. My hand tightened on the cold steel as I took a slow breath. I didn't know where the next step would lead, but I knew this. The gate that once kept us out was now mine to open for others. And with that, I stepped forward, leaving the past behind me, but never forgetting who built the door. I sat in the chair built from the bones of my father's silence. The same seat that had once decided his worth now waited for me to decide what kind of world it would build next. As my fingers brushed the cold edges of the mahogany armrest, I felt the ghosts of every man who had ever bowed before this table. I wasn't sitting in power. I was sitting inside his memory. The morning of the announcement felt unreal. The sun rose with a clarity that almost hurt to look at, painting the city in gold. Outside the company gates, cameras lined the pavement, reporters waiting for the new face of Aurelius Holdings. Inside, the air was electric, part curiosity, part disbelief. Employees filled the atrium, whispering my name like it was something they had to test on their tongues before believing it. When I stepped onto the stage, the lights were blinding, but I didn't flinch. I had walked through darker places to get here. My reflection glimmered faintly against the glass walls. A woman in a navy suit, posture steady, eyes calm. They saw a CEO, but I saw a daughter finally bringing her father home. I began my speech not with pride, but with truth. "Many of you know Aurelius Holdings as a company that builds cities," I said, my voice carrying across the hall. "But before it built towers, it built walls. Walls that divided, walls that silenced. My father stood at one of those walls for 20 years. He guarded your dreams while his own gathered dust." The room grew still. Some looked down. Others shifted uncomfortably. I didn't stop. He believed that dignity was not something given. It was something earned through quiet service. Today I sit here because of that belief. I am not here to replace him. I am here to finish what he began. When I spoke those words, I saw tears glisten in the eyes of the older employees, the ones who had once walked past him without seeing him. Even the executives who had doubted me couldn't hide their unease. I wasn't just accepting a title. I was rewriting the company's memory. My first decision as CEO was simple but symbolic. Every employee, from guard to cleaner, would receive full benefits and career development opportunities. No one would be invisible again. The same uniforms once used to define rank would now carry names embroidered in gold, a reminder that every role mattered. The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was honest, the kind that starts deep and spreads slowly like healing. After the ceremony, I walked through the corridors, past the portraits of the former CEOs. Their eyes still followed me, but no longer with judgment, almost with surrender. When I reached the lobby, I paused by the glass doors. Outside, the same steel gate shimmered under the afternoon sun. As I turned to leave, I saw him, a young security guard standing by the entrance, his uniform crisp, his gaze steady. He looked at me the way I once looked at my father, with that same hunger that only dreamers carry. Our eyes met, and for a fleeting second, I saw the story beginning again, not as a curse, but as a circle finally made whole. I smiled, knowing that this time, the gate would not close. My father never entered that building, but through me, he never left it. Every wall, every corridor, every polished tile now carried the echo of his footsteps. I used to think success meant escaping where I came from, but I've learned that real power is when you can return to the place that broke you and build it into something better. I didn't inherit an empire. I inherited a memory, and I turned it into a movement. Years passed, and Aurelius Holdings no longer looked the same. The company that once thrived on hierarchy had become a mirror of humility and purpose. The gates that once divided rich from poor now opened freely to everyone who worked beneath its roof. I built a foundation in my father's name, the Gatekeeper's Promise, a program that funded education, housing, and healthcare for the workers and their families. For the first time, the people who kept the lights on were no longer shadows. They were the heartbeat of the company. I would often walk through the training halls, watching young men and women in crisp uniforms learning not just how to work, but how to dream. Many of them came from the same neighborhoods where I had once hidden my ambitions. Some recognized my story, others only saw the title. But I always made sure they knew one thing, that the distance between the gate and the boardroom wasn't as long as the world made it seem. There were challenges, of course. Power never lets go quietly. Some investors resisted the reforms, claiming compassion was bad for profit. But when numbers rose higher than they had in decades, they fell silent. What they didn't understand was that I hadn't built a new company. I had built a new faith, a culture that measured strength not in wealth, but in kindness. One afternoon, while walking through the courtyard, I saw a line of workers gathered for lunch. They were laughing, their uniforms clean, their spirits light. For a moment, it felt like I was seeing my father's dreams alive in motion. I thought about all the nights I had watched him from across the road, too poor to understand his pain, too young to see his pride. And for the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt gratitude. He had carried the weight of silence so that I could learn to speak. Every success I achieved still carried his fingerprint. Every door I opened still felt like one he had once knocked on and been denied. But now, that door stayed open, wide enough for all who came after him. Every morning, before I enter the building, I pause by the gate. The metal is cold beneath my hand, but the air is warm with memory. The wind moves softly through the trees, carrying a voice only I can hear. Calm, steady, familiar. Welcome home, my daughter. And in that moment, I know the circle is complete. The gatekeeper's daughter no longer stands outside. She guards no door now, because she became the key. If this story touched your heart, don't just scroll away. Share it with someone who still believes that dreams can rise from dust. Tell me in the comments, what would you do if the world called you cursed? Subscribe now so you never miss the next story that will break your heart. And rebuild it. Your one click keeps these stories alive, and every view opens another gate.